Hey fiction writers, I want to talk a little bit this week about dialogue. Dialogue are the talking parts in your story, and when you write dialogue you need to use quotation marks, not just air quotes, real quotation marks. So I have a couple of examples up here so we can talk about the mechanics of it first. If you look at this first sentence at the top, that's mine, period. The period goes inside the quotation marks. Now sometimes we want to tell you who said the thing that's being said. So if we say that's mine, Jill said, look at this, the period turns into a comma. The reason is this is all one sentence. That's mine, Jill said. That's one sentence, so the punctuation comes at the end of the sentence. We add a comma in there. But as soon as I give you that rule, take a look at the next one. That's mine. And it's being yelled this time, so we have an exclamation point. The exclamation point still goes inside the quotation marks, but watch this. That's mine, Jill yelled. All right, so I just told you this is all one sentence and the punctuation has to come at the end. That doesn't hold for extreme punctuation, we'll call it. The period here is kind of not strong enough. It turns into a comma when we have something outside of the quotation marks explaining who has said what's being said. But the exclamation point holds its ground. And so we have that's mine, we keep the exclamation point, and if it's being yelled, we're probably going to say Jill yelled instead of Jill said. You could still use said. The exclamation point makes it clear that it's being yelled, but I put yelled. Now the same thing holds true for the question mark. Is that mine? And the question mark, again, inside the quotation marks. And when we add Jill asked at the end here, the question mark remains. It does not turn into a comma. So the only one that gets the shaft when you add something on the end is the period. Poor little period. The exclamation point and the question mark still stand. So those are the basic mechanics. One thing you want to keep in mind as you're writing is that it is very typical to start a new line, a new paragraph, every time you have a new speaker. So this would be an example right here. If these were being said by different people, each time there's a new speaker, we're starting a new line. So that's something to keep in mind. We often, outside of the dialogue, will tell you who said something, but if you only have two people in a conversation, you don't always have to put it, because sometimes it's obvious. If you are saying Jill said and then Peter replied, you don't want to do that down a whole page. Jill said, Peter replied, Jill said, he said, she said, he said, she said. It gets very sing-songy, so sometimes you leave it out if the reader can keep track, because you're starting a new line with each speaker. Every once in a while, note who has said something to make sure they know. Another thing that's good to do is to intersperse some action into your sentences so that when there's dialogue, we don't feel like the rest of the story has stopped, the scenery has disappeared, and we just have these two voices and nothing else. So in this example, if I was writing dialogue between two people, maybe I start here with, that's mine, Jill said, eyeing the dollar. We'll make it money. Eyeing the dollar. Okay? Now I'm going to have a new speaker, so I'm going to start a new line, and of course they're going to disagree, because that's a little more interesting. No, it's not, Peter replied. And like I said, interspersing a little action is a nice idea. So that's mine, Jill said, eyeing the dollar bill. No, it's not, Peter replied. Well, now Jill's getting a little angry, so I'm going to put the action even in front of what she says and I'm going to put it at the beginning of the next line where she will speak, and we'll say, Jill shifted Jill shifted her weight from left to right and put her hands on her hips. Now I can start dialogue right here. I don't have to start a new paragraph because I'm going to have Jill speak, and it's okay to have Jill's action come right before her words. So I'll put it right here. Yes, it is. Period. Give it back. Okay, now this is a nice place. I do not have to say she said, right? It's pretty obvious. Peter spoke, and then we have this action from Jill, and then it's pretty obvious that Jill is speaking. I do not need to put she said or Jill said. And for this next one, I think it's pretty obvious Peter's going to respond here. And he'll say, well, too bad. I found it it's mine now. And I don't need to say that's Peter because, like I said, it's obvious that it's going back and forth between the two of them. So I just wanted to give you some examples of how you can incorporate some action in there to make sure it's not just a page of straight dialogue, because then we kind of feel removed from the scene, we forget what's going on, and we want to remember our characters. And you can even use the actions in the midst of this conversation to help establish some personality of your characters. If in my next line I say, without a second thought, Jill made a fist and punched Peter in the gut. Well, those actions have told me a lot about Jill right there. The fact that she would react that way. And I can insert some dialogue here. Give it back. And I might actually put she said at the end of that. I don't know why, but it feels right. So there we have a nice little scene with some dialogue and some actions interspersed. Now, one thing I also wanted to talk about was the replied and said. It's kind of fun sometimes to come up with different words for said. She said, he replied, he stated, he retorted, he cleverly replied, he yelled, he screamed, so you can come up with a lot of different ways to say said, but if it starts to distract from your dialogue, then just go back to said. Said is always fine. And as I said, it's good to omit it when you can so that the dialogue takes center stage. All right, now, mechanics, check. Let's talk for a minute about dialogue, the way people speak. Kind of a fun thing about being a writer is that it's almost an excuse to spy on people. It's really good to eavesdrop on conversations, or just when you're having a conversation with someone, to really pay attention to the way that you speak, to the way that the other person speaks, so that you start to get a feel for the rhythm of dialogue, the way people really talk. And I would almost think that's a really valid thing to do. Go sit in a park and just kind of listen, and not necessarily to try to eavesdrop and find out what's going on in people's lives, but to hear the cadence of their voices, to hear the words they speak, and to know also people don't always use complete sentences. People cut each other off midway through sentences, people trail off, people say, it was sort of like, oh, you know, that's not even a complete thought, but people express things like that. So you want to try to be authentic with your dialogue, and one way to do that is to really pay attention to conversations going on around you and to conversations that you are having. Dialect is when you actually try to represent an accent. If someone is French or if someone is British, and you attempt to represent that accent, it can be a fun exercise, but it can also make it really hard for the reader, and it's very difficult to be consistent. So if you're going to get into that, you want to make sure you are really scrutinizing everything you write. And if you decide that someone drops the G's at the end of their words and says things like singing, running, then you need to make sure you do it every time that person talks. I would really, for the most part, avoid dialect. You might make a reference at some point in the writing, that a person has an accent, and then let your reader go ahead and create that in their head if they want to. But spelling words in a strange way, you almost have to be an anthropologist to get it right. So that's kind of dangerous territory, and I would kind of recommend against it for the most part. Last thing I'm going to talk about with dialogue is profanity. Making your characters swear. Sometimes it's necessary, and that's kind of my litmus test. You need to read it over and find out, does the scene really gain something by me putting this in here? Is there any way to express what this character's feeling without profanity, or is the profanity completely necessary? If you feel like it's completely necessary and it's not just gratuitous, then you can use it, certainly. But if it's just gratuitous and it doesn't really have a lot to do with the character, then it's going to take away from your story. So you need to think about that the same way you think about dialect. You need to know if it really is important in developing your character to put it in there or not. So there's a little bit about dialogue, and I have put in a folder called Writing Dialogue on the website a couple of links to web pages that tell you some tips for writing dialogue, and those would be great to take a look at. And then your assignment for next week will be, if you are writing a story and you want to continue with it and you like the open-ended kind of assignment, continue writing and try to incorporate some dialogue, keeping the mechanics of it in mind, and trying to start a new line for each speaker, and trying to incorporate some action in with your dialogue and get the punctuation right and all of that business. So that's the open-ended. Continue with your story, incorporate some dialogue, submit those pages. If you would like a more specific assignment, there are dialogue exercises. I'm trying to remember what I called that. I think I just called it dialogue exercise. It's also in the Writing Dialogue folder, and what it is a document that has 4 or 5 situations on it. And what you do is choose one of the situations and write a page of dialogue for it. So those are your choices: the specific dialogue exercise or the open-ended story with dialogue. So keep that in mind. Mechanics, style, and good luck with your writing assignment. I'm really enjoying reading everything you guys are doing. Take care.